Screeching guitars, flamboyant bands, lyrics obsessed with sex, Satanism, and even suicide. This is not mainstream rock and roll. It's the music of today's teen rebellion. What's it about?
Togetherness, man. We gotta stick together and fight,
one
man.
giant family.
We gotta fight for our right, man. To listen to our music, to party, man.
I think it's time, that Frank Zappa was saying, if your kid comes home with an album with a guy with a chainsaw between his legs, you better find out what that music is talking about.
Hello friends and subscribers, and welcome to my second top 10 video. Today's subject will be the top 10 metal albums of 1986. The very first top 10 list I did was my favorite black metal bands. While the next list could have been another top 10 bands of another genre I like, I felt like doing something slightly different for a change, and rather than focus on a particular genre, we will focus on a particular year. So why 1986? Well, it was 30 years ago, and a lot of kick-ass classics of metal just turned 30. Now, to the uninitiated here, let's take a brief glance at the history of heavy metal. The genre's origins can be traced to the hard rock, surf rock, blues, and psychedelic rock of the 1960s, and by 1970, the first metal album to be dropped would be Black Sabbath's eponymous debut album. By the early 70s, hard rock bands like The Who and Led Zeppelin were dominating the musical scene, while only a handful of pioneers like Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, and Judas Priest, and a couple others released a few metal albums throughout the 1970s. The metal genre itself really didn't kickstart until the twilight of the 70s and would last for well over a decade. If you ask me, metal's golden years were between 1979 and 1991. With one full decade in between, that being the 1980s, which kicked off with a new wave of British heavy metal, led by bands like Saxon, Iron Maiden, Diamond Head, Motorhead, and Venom, to name a few. The new wave of British heavy metal dominated the early 80s and peaked from 1979 to 1982. By the mid-80s, the dominating metal bands were the American and European thrash metal bands inspired by the new wave of British heavy metal and hardcore punk. Leading thrash metal were the likes of Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Sodom, Overkill, Anthrax, to name a few. By the time the late 80s came to be, metal became more extreme with pioneering black and death metal bands like Death, Bathory, Possessed, Obituary, and Celtic Frost. I know I probably glossed over some of the other important shit, but come on, you know that was basically the evolution of 80s metal in a nutshell. So we have the year 1986, and while pretty much every other year the 80s was an excellent year for metal, 1986 was probably one of the best, if not the best year for heavy metal. It serves as a great cornerstone because the legends that formed in the 70s and early 80s were still dropping some of their best work at this time, and some of the soon-to-become legends were just releasing some of their first records that would become some of the best the genre had to offer. I should also state that this list was an even harder list to come up with than the last one, because even just by looking at the Wikipedia page, there was a lot of fucking metal albums that came out in 1986. Many of them were just fucking masterpieces. Others were disaster pieces. Some overrated, some underrated, but overall 1986 was a fucking treasure trove for heavy metal. So I can't hold out any longer. Let's dig right the fuck into what I would consider my top 10 favorite metal albums in 1986. Number 10. Trilogy by Yngwie Malmsteen. Yngwie Malmsteen is a name that there are even a surprisingly significant number of metalheads are unfamiliar with. But here's a trivia question for you. Is Yngwie Malmsteen the name of the band like Led Zeppelin, Or is Yngwie Malmsteen the name of the singer like Ozzy Osbourne who's backed up by a band? Trick question because Yngwie Malmsteen is the guitarist who is backed up by a band. Yes, Yngwie Malmsteen is overlooked in the pantheon of metal guitar gods, but he was the inspiration to a certain Metalocalypse character.
We don't think that metals to be nice to each other.
For those of you who don't know him, Yngwie Malmsteen unsurprisingly became a metal guitar god and genius composer for two primary reasons. One was that he was raised in a musical family, learning to play the guitar since before he was 10, and the fact his biggest musical inspirations were overlooked top-notch musicians like Ritchie Blackmore of Deep Purple and Uli Jon Roth of the Scorpions, as well as the classical Italian violin composer named Niccolò Paganini. Before becoming a solo musician, Yngwie made a slight name for himself playing in an LA band called Steeler for their only album, which is self-titled, and then briefly in Alcatraz on their debut album, No Parole from Rock and Roll. Yngwie had a falling out with his previous bands because, to put it bluntly, they feared his talent, although they needed it, but they needed it controlled. Yngwie then decided if he were to completely express his boundless musical brilliance, he would need to do it alone. In 1984 and 1985, he recorded his first two records, Rising Force and Marching Out, featuring Jeff Scott Soto on vocals. Moving forward with his solo career, Yngwie is best known for being one of the key pioneers of the neoclassical metal genre, a genre that, as its name implies, is extremely influenced by classical music, which is why it is probably the most technical in regards to playing style than any other metal genre. 1986's Trilogy is another exercise in neoclassical, but has a more pop feel to it, making it sound glammy in a lot of places, particularly on the song Queen in Love. Trilogy is perhaps the most musically impressive album on this list, but due to the fact that it has a pop and glam metal feel is why it's only listed at number 10. But it was probably this more commercial approach that ended up having Trilogy be considered the album that put Yngwie Malmsteen on the map, so to say. Trilogy also features a new singer, Mark Bowles, who is often considered the greatest singers to be featured with Yngwie Malmsteen, and he's my personal favorite as well. Unlike his first two albums, which demonstrate Yngwie's skill, they kind of did just that, demonstrate skill. Marching Out tried to correct this a bit, but Trilogy was truly the album that did that with more passionate songwriting and riffs that actually make you feel something, and the end result was 9 epic, master-crafted tunes, with my personal favorite of the bunch being Fury. But another thing I'd like to mention, I for one appreciate the album art. I bet many of you are like, huh? What? What's so special about it? I mean, it's no In the Night Side Eclipse or The Somber Lane, but it's not the fact that it's beautiful, but it's the fact there's a green 3-headed dragon on it. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with European mythology and culture, that's no ordinary dragon. As some of you may know, I am Polish-American. Slavic, and in ancient Slavic mythology, a green 3-headed dragon is known as a Zhime. I'm not sure whoever designed the album art knew that, but I appreciate this throwback to obscure Slavic mythology. What does this have to do with the album? Nothing, just a piece of trivia you should know. But closing, if you're new to Yngwie Malmsteen, then make sure this is the first album of his that you listen to, because this album is a fucking gem among 80s metal and is often considered his greatest, which is why I have it listed as one of the best metal albums of 1986. Number 9, Metal in Hell by Cat. Here is a band only those who have searched far and wide the depths of hell to uncover every hidden gem in the metal underground will find Metal in Hell by the band Cat. Well, except of course if you're from where the band comes from, hailing from Eastern Bloc Poland. That's right. For those who aren't purely familiar with Cold War-era politics and history, in the 1980s, Poland was a satellite state of the USSR, being east of East Germany where the Soviet influence was most heavy, putting it far behind the Iron Curtain of communism. It's probably making some of you scratch your head thinking, but I thought all they listened to behind the Iron Curtain was this. Well, maybe in Russia, but understand this. Not all communist states in Europe were exactly in line with Russia's hardline, particularly Yugoslavia from the very beginning, which was actually one of the founding countries of the non-aligned movement in the early 60s, after Tito's refusal to be a puppet of Stalin, making Yugoslavia the black sheep, so to say, among communist states. Being on decent terms with both Western Europe and Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia allowed Western cultural influences across the border, paving way to a notable rock, punk, new wave, pop, and yes, even heavy metal scene. Somewhat following in Yugoslavia's example, Poland by the early 1970s started to normalize relations with the West, and it was only a matter of time before Western culture, and that includes heavy metal, started to find an audience there, prompting the people to try to form their own metal bands in Poland. Bolstering that in the mid-80s was when Iron Maiden became one of the first bands to tour behind the Iron Curtain on their 1984 to 85 World Slavery Tour, doing shows in Poland, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. So with metal finding its way into communist Poland, it was only a matter of time before Polish metal bands would emerge, and leading them would be Cat, which is Polish for executioner. Despite being formed in the late 70s and early 80s, their debut album would not be released until many years later, probably as a result of the political crises facing Poland in the first half of the 80s, but that debut album would be Metal in Hell. Arguably the closest thing to a black metal album on this list, which is why it's included in my Black Metal 101 playlist. Upon listening to this record, there's actually sort of a blending to it. At one moment, the band will be playing Bathory-sounding black metal, and then literally the next moment, they'll be playing standard operating thrash till death. And of course, there's some good old-time heavy metal on this as well. If you call back to my first top 10, I mentioned that newer Dark Throne, except for their newest release Arctic Thunder, tries to sound like every 80s metal band ever and fails at it, going for the vintage thrash, power, and first wave black metal and traditional metal sound. Cat's Metal in Hell is what Dark Throne between 2006 and 2016 should have sounded like, but no. Now, as for the band, on this record they sound like Venom if they were fronted by Udo Dirkschneider of Accept. So if you like Venom and Accept, you should definitely give these guys a listen, which brings me to the one cautionary caveat for this album. The first time I listened to this, I did not initially dig the vocals of the singer Roman Kostrzeski. I mentioned he kind of sounds like Udo Dirkschneider, but he actually sounds more like a cross between Udo and Maniac of Mayhem, the latter of whom many people consider to be nails on a chalkboard, so be wary of that. The lyrics in this album are in English, and yet it's a little hard to understand what he's saying apart from the lo-fi production. But to me, he's more listenable than other singers on this list. But now this album has 10 killer tracks, and it's kind of hard to just go ahead and pick a favorite. Any of the first 3 tracks would do, but the fan favorite Time of Revenge is a well-deserved fan favorite. but my personal favorite would be track number 2, Killer. And there you have it, folks. Metal in Hell. Not exactly the best on this list, but it's arguably the best Polish album of the 1980s, and possibly the greatest Polish metal album ever, so check this shit out now. Number 8. Fatal Portrait by King Diamond. Here is one some of you new folk may have never heard of. But every metalhead who has become acquainted with the genre for at least, I don't know, the past 2 months should very well know who King Diamond is. You see, kids, before there was Marilyn Manson in the 90s and early 2000s, the real Antichrist superstar was this man, King Diamond. I know some of you have never heard of him, but by 1986, King Diamond has already established a name for himself as the frontman of Danish first-wave black metal band Merciful Fate. And speaking of black metal, in my first top 10 video on black metal bands, I reviewed 3 out of the 4 countries considered Scandinavian: Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and now I have come to complete it, because King Diamond is from Denmark. Yeah, technically it's not Scandinavia, but come on, since there were Viking kingdoms in Denmark, it fucking counts, now fuck off. Anyway, his first band, Merciful Fate, is how many metalheads, myself included, became familiar with this legendary singer. And legendary he is, with his usual singing range in the falsetto well above, say, Bruce Dickinson or Rob Halford. Apart from his range, King Diamond was truly the first musician to use corpse paint, in which black metal musicians in the late 80s and 90s onwards would adopt. King Diamond was a pioneer in more ways than one, which is more than what you would say about other metal musicians. Now, having departed from Merciful Fate after 2 excellent albums and a fierce disagreement over musical direction, King Diamond made his solo project.
But most important was the musical side of the whole thing, because the former guitarist Hank Sherman, who used to write most of the songs, he came up with new material which had nothing to do with Merciful Fate at all, and he insisted on getting on the next album. It was pure pop music, and I wouldn't put my name to that.
Because it was doing so well at 2, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Really
we just came back from touring the States for 2 months.
The first record of his solo career would be this, Fatal Portrait. So what makes this album so great? Well, if you liked Merciful Fate, but did not properly acquaint yourself with King Diamond's solo work, this is a great start. Just don't run into this thinking you're going to get Merciful Fate, because that's not what you're going to get. Although I've run into people who consider this the album to be the perfect successor to Don't Break the Oath. Now let's talk about it musically. At age 30, King's voice was still in its prime, but apart from his haunting banshee wails, I personally think the guitar work on this album also deserves some standout mentioning. The King usually sings, but on the instrumental track Voices of the Past, the King himself wields the axe, so to say, and he does a better job than what someone often associated solely with performing vocals would do. The guitar slaying on this album by Andy LaRocque and Michael Denner also deserves some mentioning, because some of their riffs and solos are some of the most beautiful I've ever heard. Mickey D, who would later become best known for drumming in Motorhead later on, does a superb drum work here as well, but the track where he truly stands out is on the album closer, Haunted. On the subject of tracks, the first 4 of them and Haunted form the story for this album, so to say. The story is about the spirit of a young girl named Molly, whose face burns in every candle because, for several years, her mother locked her in the attic until she died. Her mother painted a portrait of her, which she later burned, setting Molly's spirit free and haunting her mother to the point of insanity. But my favorite track is actually not from one of the story tracks. My favorite song on this album would be Karen, a song about the ferryman of Hades from the ancient Greek pantheon. Fatal Portrait is dark and occult written, as one would expect it to be, being that it was made by King Diamond, and of course this is obviously one of his greatest offerings of his solo work, and certainly worthy contender of being one of the absolute best metal records of 1986. Number 7, Rain and Blood by Slayer. Slayer needs no introduction, being one of the most revered thrash metal bands of all time, highlighted as being one of the big 4 alongside Metallica, Megadeth, and Anthrax. Slayer stands out amongst their equals for being harsher and more aggressive in regards to overall musicianship. It was Slayer's aggression that made them one of the more influential thrash bands on some of the pioneering black and death metal bands, with their fast and heavy riffs, pulverizing drums, and lyrical themes dealing with stuff like Satanism, war, and violence. If there is one band in all that lives up to the name, it's Slayer. Why? Because they fucking slay, and exemplifying this would be their 3rd album and current subject, Rain and Blood. Often considered their finest work to date, and its opinion I certainly share. The first 2 Slayer albums were somewhat lo-fi, fast, and heavy, but Rain and Blood just upped the ante in the speed department mostly, but also, to a minor extent, the other key factors of what makes Slayer Slayer are just as strong and prevalent on this album. I've encountered some commenters who say the speed of this album and other factors expose some of the more hardcore punk influence that helped out this legendary act. The lineup on this record was the best they ever had. Dave Lombardo on drums, Kerry King on lead guitar, and the late guitar master and true musical genius in Slayer, Jeff Hanneman on rhythm guitar, with Tommy Araya on bass and vocals. The end result was a 10-track monstrosity of a masterpiece, opening and closing with fan favorites Angel of Death and Raining Blood, respectively. It's also worth noting that apart from these 2 tracks and post-mortem, the other 7 tracks on here clock in at under 3 minutes each. This stands in stark contrast with their previous album, Hell Awaits, as most of the songs on that album had song lengths in the 4 minutes or longer. Song length aside, each track on this album fucking kills. Not one dud or tune out of place. When I listen to Slayer, and this album in particular, I feel like I'm on a battlefield charging into enemy lines. The 2 fan favorites on this album are, as I mentioned, were Angel of Death and Raining Blood, which were both composed by the aforementioned Jeff Hanneman. Much like Ace of Spades for Motorhead, these 2 songs are regularly featured in live shows. However, if you ask me, my personal favorite on the album would be track number 2, Piece by Piece. You have no choice of life or death, but things you will not see. I'll rip your flesh till there's no breath, to spend the destiny. Soon as life has left your call, I'll make you part of me. No emotion, death is all I see. The fans who were watching this knew that it would have been a crime not to include this album on the list. It's the quintessential Slayer album. The same reoccurring lyrical themes, ball-busting riffs, and distinct aggression that makes Slayer Slayer. Metal publications often put this album as Slayer's best, and one of the best albums of the entire thrash metal genre, and they aren't lying. I know, there are metal records out there that are often listed as the best of the genre, and are woefully untrue. But people aren't lying when they say this is one of the best. Sadly, I can't articulate this album as well as the others on the list, and maybe due to the fact that apart from this album and a few others, I'm actually not that big of a Slayer fan. Not that I think they're bad or even overrated, but they really just don't make me want to cling to them as much as I do with other bands. But that alone does not diminish the brutality of 1986's thrash metal masterpiece, Rain and Blood. Check the shit out of this album right now. Number 6. Pleasure to Kill by Creator. The year was 2009. Sometime that summer when I picked up my first Creator album, and if you guessed it was Pleasure to Kill, then no shocker. Now, I bet there are some uninitiated wondering, well, I've heard of Metallica and Megadeth and even Slayer, but who the hell are Creator? Now, I've been a fan of thrash metal ever since I was around 13 years old. I mean, you know, I learned all about the Big Four and other prominent thrash metal bands, but it was not until around the time that I turned 15 that I learned about what people referred to as the Teutonic thrash metal scene, with its big three being Sodom, Destruction, and Creator. Distinct from the Big Four of America, the Teutonic bands were more darker and raw than their American counterparts, with these three's very, very first releases often being argued as being part of the first wave of black metal of the early to mid-80s and were pretty influential on shaping death metal in the late 80s. Creator's debut album was Endless Pain in 1985, and Mike Petroza's vocals on that album are why many people consider it a first-wave black metal album. But we're not here to talk about Endless Pain, we're here to talk about Pleasure to Kill, which is just as aggressive and thrashy as Endless Pain, but took a more borderline death metal edge, and is somewhat heavier as a result. The final result is what many often consider a cornerstone of the thrash metal genre, and personally one of my favorite thrash metal albums ever done by a European band. But unlike other albums on this list, I sadly do not dig every single track on this one. Why? Well, at this time, Creator had two vocalists, the regular Mike Petroza, who also served as the band's lead guitarist, and then some of the vocals were occasionally done by drummer Jürgen Riehl. And I'm sorry, I'm just not a big fan of Jürgen's vocals. I tried to like them, I really did, but I just don't. I prefer Mike. He sounds like a calculating, sadistic serial killer, while Jürgen just sounds like an impulsive madman.
Greedy for blood, nourished by power, a decision to die. Tales of terror, deep in the corners, passionate to kill. Cuffs on the ground, mind starts to chill. A man lies in the corner.
To articulate my taste in vocals, I prefer people who can sing really in the higher registries. Which is why, although there's more to it than that, I prefer black metal to death metal, Dickinson to Di'Anno, and Mike Petroza to Jürgen Riehl. Not to say that the tracks where Jürgen is singing are bad, but I just personally can't get past his vocals. Sorry. So why is this ranked above 4 other albums where you said you liked all the tracks on those ones? If you really want to know why, while I did like every track on the albums that I ranked before this, I will tell you this. The songs that I do like on this record, I will pick any day of the week over even my personal favorites on the albums I placed behind this one. And perhaps if Mike did the vocals on all the tracks that I didn't like, perhaps this record would be even higher on the list than number 6. Now, as for the record and the music, I mentioned this album is more death metal-like than the previous album, which is more black metal-like. Although lyrical content usually doesn't define the genre, black metal and death metal do tend to have different lyrical subject matters. The lyrics on Endless Pain were along the lines of being darker and more evil, but the lyrics here are generally more violent and brutal. The vocals on this album were more death metal-like as well. Mike's vocals on Endless Pain were basically the black metal snarl we all know and love. But here it's more of a guttural rasp. But the true thing that makes this album more death metal-like than its predecessor actually took me a while to figure out, and it was actually the guitar playing on this album. In the years to come, the Swedish death metal scene emerged in the late 80s and early 90s, and what it did to set itself apart from the American pioneers musically was that Swedish death metal bands tend to use what is referred to as the buzzsaw.
I should show you how to get the greatest guitar sound ever, which is that classic Swedish death metal guitar sound. Start with, you should have a Gibson guitar. They're probably the best ones for getting the really fat sound. And you need to have the Buzz heavy metal pedal. It can be pretty hard to get now because all the guitarists of Entombed and Dismember, they collect these. They have like 20 each, just for, you can't get them anymore. So these levels must all be turned max, 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 all to 11 basically. And you turn it on, and the guitar sounds by itself, and then you get this super fat sound. And that's the way you do it. Swedish death metal.
And go to the darkest depths and catch it within myself. You are the witnessing God.
I've mentioned before the Teutonic thrash metal bands, and that means created or influential to death metal, but let's squint back on the guitars on Pleasure to Kill. It's for this and many other reasons why Pleasure to Kill is often cited as one of the most important thrash metal records ever released. But every decent album has a standout, and to me, that would be the title track.
Now that the mission's done, body forgot to be killed, I return to the cemetery.
Number 5, Epicus Unicus Metallicus by Candlemass. Being that it was 1986, you would expect a lot of thrash metal on this list, and there is. I mean, 1986 saw the release of many groundbreaking thrash metal albums, but we're going to take a look at one of the few groundbreaking releases that were not thrash metal of that time. Epicus Doomicus Metallicus is the debut album of Swedish band Candlemass. The album's title is faux Latin for epic doom metal. Like Venom's 1982 album Black Metal, this would be the album to coin the name of a new genre of heavy metal. Well, actually a subgenre of heavy metal, doom metal as a style known for being slower than the other metal genres, and even heavier as well. Black Sabbath are sometimes considered a doom or proto-doom metal band, so what about Candlemass? Well, Candlemass made their doom metal a little more operatic in regards to vocals, and their music was a little more melodic than other doom metal bands, and lyrically had themes dealing with fantasy, which is usually the primary theme to power metal. But nonetheless, these factors allowed the band to choose a name to suit their particular style, epic doom metal. Candlemass, for this reason, are considered one of the most important doom metal bands to ever be formed, as they are credited for creating a subgenre that contributed heavily to doom metal as a whole later on. After initially being introduced to the genre by Stephen O'Malley's mid to late 90s Seattle doom metal band Burning Witch back when I was in 8th grade, this was the band that made me truly appreciate the genre. Candlemass at this time consisted of Claes Bergwall and Mats Bjorkman on guitars, and Leif Eldling on bass, with Mark Ekström on drums. The band did not have a regular singer at this time, but recruited a guy by the name of Johan Langvist to be the session vocalist for recording the debut album in February of 1986. The end result was a superb 6-track monolith. The opening track is Solitude, with an acoustic intro about a man wishing to die in solitude.
I long for my time to come. Death means just life. Please let me die in solitude.
The next track is Demon's Gate, a 9-minute masterpiece about a sinner entering hell. And a personal side note, as part of my high school soundtrack in 10th grade, I'd usually listen to the song when getting off the bus from school. I don't know why, I just did.
Approach the eyeball, opens for you, requires damnation, call you on through twilight processes.
The next track is Crystal Ball, probably my personal favorite off the album, which is about, you guessed it, visions in a crystal ball.
See what it tells. It can bring you a fortune. You so well. Visions and dreams you can see in the crystal ball.
The Black Stone Wielder is probably the doomiest song on the album. It's a great 7-minute track about the cult of artisans who wield and worship black stone as they pass their rights down to the next generation.
The rain kept on falling and darkened the sky. The dawn was to come with the sunrise.
This is followed by the song Under the Oak, which is another song about someone in despair, and is arguably even heavier and doomier than the Black Stone Wielder in some parts, at least, especially in the beginning in mind. We then conclude this masterpiece of a debut album with The Sorcerer's Pledge, a song about a sorcerer and his dark magic.
Back in the jungle selection, all the sorcerers who hold, cracked the blood on the virgin to be reborn.
After the album was recorded, it was released in June of 1986. The band was subsequently dropped from their label initially due to disappointing album sales. The band begged Johan Langvist to join the band, but he refused, preferring to work on his original project, Jonah Quiz, a more commercial project that went nowhere fast. But interestingly, a few years ago, back in 2013, as part of one of their tours, they did shows playing this album in its entirety, and Johan joined the band on stage to perform. Again, this is one of the most important doom metal albums to be released, and it is one of the genre's best, which is why Epicus Doomicus Metallicus is on the list. Number 4, Morbid Visions by Sepultura. Europe and North America are home to some of the most brutal and influential bands in extreme metal, which is an umbrella term used to describe thrash metal, black metal, death metal, and occasionally doom metal, but it seems to most people nowadays the term usually just refers to death metal and black metal. But back to the geography I mentioned earlier, a lot of people overlook that South America and Brazil in particular were home to equally important and influential extreme metal acts. Arguably the most brutal and extreme band of the Brazilian scene was Sepultura, founded by the Cavaleira brothers, including the famed Max Cavaleira, long before he formed his more popular projects Soulfly and Cavaleira Conspiracy. Early Sepultura was an early pioneering extreme metal act. Just before this album was dropped in 1986, the black metal and death metal genres were in their infancy, and at this time, up until the early 90s, black metal and death metal were used almost interchangeably because there was no clear-cut way to define them musically. And some early albums that influenced both genres did kind of blur the line between early death metal and early black metal. Sepultura's Morbid Visions is one such album. Now there are people probably wondering, well, I thought black metal and death metal were the same thing. they're not. And this is not one of these goofy genre debates that contemporary metal heads have either. I'm not going to explain the differences, but you'll get a taste of it later on. Anyway, the releases following Morbid Visions would place Sepultura as an early death metal act, but some consider Morbid Visions a first-wave black metal album. To compare, the first proper black metal album would probably be Bathory's debut album released in 1984. There's much debate over what is considered the first true death metal album. I lean towards Possessed's 1985 debut album, Seven Churches. So what does Morbid Vision sound like? Scratching your head? If you ask me, this very well could be the very first blackened death metal album. The satanic lyrics, lo-fi production, and guitar playing on this record gives the album a more black metal feel, but the vocals and drumming on this record sound way more death metal than black metal. Whatever genre you consider this album, it doesn't matter, because this album kicks some serious fucking ass. You would certainly know it if you came across the original vinyl pressing that had included Carl Orff's O Fortuna as the intro. O Fortuna? What the heck is that? But what makes this album truly impressive than the others was the fact that when Sepultura put this together, they were only in their mid to late teens. Max Cavalier was born in August of 1969, and the band recorded this in August of 86, meaning he was barely 17 years old. His brother Igor, who did drums on the album, was born in 1970, meaning he was fucking 16! Paul Jr., who played bass, and Yario Gudez, who played guitar, were born in the late 60s, making them pretty young as well. As for the end result, all I could say is, damn. I've come across bands who made killer music starting off in their teens, but fucking A. Sepultura's Morbid Visions is probably one of the best, if not the best album you will ever listen to that had more than 2 people on it, all of whom were under 20 years old. As stated before, there is not one weak track on this record. But the album is not entirely flawless. There are several moments in a couple of songs that go occasionally sloppy. But this still does not do dick to trivialize the fact that this is overall an impressive record considering the background of how it came to be. Best track? I can't really say. Roll off on a D8, but if forced to pick, I would go with the album closer, Empire of the Damned. Wrapping up, I would just like to say if this was your first exposure to the musical genius of Max Cavalera, then you don't need hindsight bias to know that he would in the years to come becoming one of the heavy metal's greatest musicians and songwriters, all evident on the first full-length album he played on, 1986's Morbid Visions. Number 3, Darkness Descends by Dark Angel. Dark Angel is one of the lesser-known thrash metal bands, but this album makes that fact a fucking crime. While Dark Angel is not super well known, even among connoisseurs of thrash metal, but it was a project that boasted one of death metal and thrash metal's greatest drummers, Gene Hogland, who would later drum for Testament, Death, and Death Clock. So if you're a fan of Gene and other stuff he did, you know you're in for a fucking treat with Dark Angel. Thrash metal's peak was in 1986, with most thrash metal bands I can think of having an album released that year. And I will say that out of all the thrash metal albums to be released that year, I would not name this to be the best or even my personal favorite, but I will say it was probably the most overlooked thrash metal record of that year. While it is true that most metal publications consider this a quintessential cornerstone of the genre as one of its best, with Revolver being one publication that rightfully states this as one of the top 14 thrash metal albums that is mandatory for all fans of the genre to own. That said, I usually don't find many thrash metal fans extolling this album's virtues as much as others in contrast to the publications. But back for it to being mandatory for all metalheads and thrashers to own, it is this fact that makes me regret to admit the following. I first became acquainted with this album back in 2009. I listened to it because at that time thrash was my favorite genre of metal and could only really listen to this album on YouTube because I couldn't find this in any record store I ventured to. So I am somewhat embarrassed to admit that it was not up until a little over a month ago that I finally procured my own copy of this fucking blood diamond of Bay Area thrash metal. So how does Dark Angel compare to other thrash metal bands, and how does this album compare to other albums that were being released at the time? Well, thrash metal is something of a double-edged sword. One edge being that there are thrash bands who err on the side of being more catchy and melodic like Metallica, Anthrax, and Overkill, and there are even some thrash bands who err on the side of being more extreme and dark, serving as an inspiration to infant death and black metal bands like the Teutonic thrash metal scene's Big Three, Sodom, Creator, and Destruction, and Dark Angel, who are without question on the more extreme side and arguably the most death and black metal-like of the 1980s American thrash bands. As I mentioned in my top 10 black metal bands video, Slayer was once considered by some a first-wave black metal band, and of course many early death metal bands cite them as an influence. Not to mention that Rain and Blood made this very list, but I will go on and tell you this. Darkness Descends outclasses everything Slayer has ever done and certainly puts Rain and Blood to shame in regards to its ferocity. Yeah, I know, there's going to be some angry Slayer fantards gnashing their teeth on it when I said that, but whatever, fuck off. So enough hyping it, let's discuss this album musically. The album is 35 minutes long with 7 merciless tracks. As I mentioned, Gene Hoglan's probably the most well-known person in the band, and this was their first album to feature him, having replaced their previous drummer, Drax Schwartz. Gene was the secondary songwriter on this record, with the primary songwriting being done by guitarist Jim Durkin, who pretty much had a hand in composing every song on the album. However, Gene shared the music writing responsibility for the title track with Durkin and composed the lyrics to it. He also wrote the lyrics to Hunger of the Undead, Death is Certain, and Black Prophecies. He also co-wrote the lyrics with Durkin and singer Don Doty to arguably the album's most famous track, The Burning of Sodom. He also co-wrote the music to these songs as well. So he did a lot for this album apart from just the drumming. The production on this album is pretty lo-fi considering it was released by Combat Records and produced by Randy Burns. But that aside, this album earned the band's nickname, the LA Coffee Machine. This album showcases the apex of thrash metal, faster than light guitar riffs, while simultaneously being heavier than Orga on an aircraft carrier on a planet with hypergravity, complete with nightmare-inducing guitar solos. And I bring that one up because many years ago when I used to take guitar lessons, I had a guitar teacher who was cool enough to let me bring songs that I wanted to learn how to play, and one of them was Burning of Sodom. He never taught me how to play the solos, but when we still listen to them, and on that track I remember him telling me something like, "Man, that guitar solo is going to give me nightmares. Why'd you have to pick this song?" And I will never forget that. Now, as for everything else, the drumming was just as brutal as 1,000 lashes, and lyrical themes darker than a story of flaying orphans alive over the grave of their dead parents. And equally important is Don Doty's guttural singing and his high-pitched shrieking.
She's guilty, crime is life, sin is death, darkness is sin.
And while we're on the subject of Don Doty, this would be the final Dark Angel album to feature him as a vocalist before being replaced by Ron Reinhardt. Sadly, never to return to music again up until a few years ago in 2013, fronting a new band called Eliminate and performing guest vocals on the Violent Omen song Contradiction Mind to their album Lunacy. I mentioned earlier that Doty helped compose lyrics on some of the tracks and wrote all of them for the album closer Perish in Flames. Wrapping up, out of the 7 tracks of this album, I am not sure which is my favorite. It's a 3-way tie between the title track, Burning a Sodom, or Merciless Death. Roll a D3 on any of those. Each of those tracks is a fucking masterpiece in its own right. I mean, you could probably say that about the other 4 songs too, but those 3 are definitely the 3 diamonds on this golden crown that is Darkness Descends by Dark Angel. And one more thing. Apart from it being a crime against heavy metal to not own this release, you're better off getting a CD, vinyl, or even fucking cassette copy. If listening to this off of a computer just fucking neuters its sound and can be somewhat underwhelming. I liked the record as it was, even just listening to it on YouTube, but I came to fucking worship this album even more than the first time, blasting it on my grandfather's car stereo when I first popped the CD in for the first time and drove about listening to it. It improves it that fucking much. Try it. Darkness Descends, it fucking destroys. But there are 2 more albums I would put above this one. Number 2, Somewhere in Time by Iron Maiden.
Out in the street, somebody's crying. Out in the night, the fire's burn.
If there are any uninitiated here, you may not be familiar with some of the other bands on this list, but you most definitely have heard of Iron Maiden. Come on. Every teenage metalhead at your high school or college wore an Iron Maiden shirt at least once a week. You also probably heard they are considered the greatest heavy metal band to dominate the known universe. Now, I do not necessarily agree with that, but it's not something I would vehemently deny either. Whether they are the greatest heavy metal band of all time or not, one fact is irrefutable, and that is Maiden is most certainly the most popular heavy metal band of all time, and they have that status for a fucking reason, and it's not an entirely undeserved one either. Many metalheads are divided on what to make of their material the band released since their 1988 album, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, but most if not all agree that Maiden's first 7 records easily rank as some of the top-notch and exceptional best that heavy metal has to offer. Now, I do not think that of all of their first 7 records deserve such distinctions, but I do believe it applies to their 1986 album, Somewhere in Time. This was Maiden's 6th studio album, and their very first to be significantly experimental. Their first 5 albums are standard heavy metal, being one of the top dominators of the new wave of British heavy metal, although many say their first 2 albums featuring singer Paul Di'Anno are slightly more punkier than what they did afterwards. But don't you dare say that to Maiden's founder, bassist Steve Harris, who to this very day denies Maiden was ever inspired by punk and that he hates punk rock and always has. While Maiden's first 2 albums do have significant nods to punk to them, which went with singer Paul Di'Anno after he got kicked out, they are still straight up heavy metal. So what about Somewhere in Time? Well, it's still heavy metal, but it is unique in the fact that this album experimented with guitar synthesizers and reverb-drenched vocals, giving the album a dirty cyberpunk atmosphere, and boy did it fucking work. The record was inspired by Ridley Scott's 1982 sci-fi masterpiece, Blade Runner, and the band made no attempts to hide it, opening with the movie's theme on the supporting tour, blatantly referencing the movie on the album art, and of course the promotional photos. This album was a bold risk for Iron Maiden for the time. How? Well, at the time, synthesizers were still fairly new and were all the rage in mainstream music, and that is what record companies wanted from newer artists. Synth rock was one of the genres that dominated the mainstream of the 1980s, and if you were a metal band using synthesizers, That was often a sign you were selling out. Exhibit A. In the same year as Somewhere in Time came out in 1986, another legendary metal band decided to experiment with synthesizers for a more commercial release, and ended up making arguably the most despised record of their otherwise celebrated career, that being Judas Priest with their disaster piece, Turbo. Maiden, on the other hand, had used synthesizers to enhance their guitars and reverb-coated vocals, and not the other way around, which would have destroyed this record and their reputation. Now, apart from that, it's still your standard classic Maiden record. Adrian Smith and Dave Murray's twin-linked guitar harmonies still slay. Bruce's vocals are still peaking at this point. Steve's bass playing and songwriter are still unmatched, and Nico's drumming are as great as they would be. The songs vary, balancing between fast and mid-pace in the songwriting, and it's got a few songs that relate to the album's general theme, like the title track, and a ballad of history like the album closer, Alexander the Great. And everything in between, like the two singles, Stranger in a Strange Land, written by guitarist Adrian Smith about an Arctic explorer who dies after being frozen in ice and discovered a century later.
100 years of time, men again, they came that way to find the answer to the mystery. They found this body lying where it fell on that day, preserved in time for all to see.
And then there is Wasted Years, probably the most celebrated song on this record. It's a superb track that the band wrote describing what they were personally going through during the World Slavery Tour in support of their previous album, Power Slave, which at the time for many years would be Maiden's longest and most strenuous world tour they ever did, lasting 11 straight months, which by the end of it, the band was fucking beat and decided to take a whole year off from touring as a result.
Close my eyes and think of home. Another city goes by in the night. Ain't it funny how it is? You never miss it till it's down the way.
But they still hit the studio in 1986 to bring us this fucking masterpiece, which is sometimes overlooked compared to other records in the band's discography. Coincidentally, while it is being my second favorite album from 1986, it is also my second favorite Iron Maiden album. There is not one bad or slightly weak track on this album. My favorite, of course, would be the title track.
If you had the time to lose, an open mind, a time to choose, would you care to take a look? Why can't you read me like a book? It's always on my side.
What is this garbage you're watching? I want to watch the news.
Are you making headway at least?
This is the news.
Number 1. Peace Sells, But Who's Buying by Megadeth.
I had too much to drink. Said I was having boys.
Here we are, my favorite and top pick for best metal album of 1986. And I know what some of you are thinking. I don't get it, Black Lord. In none of your other videos you indicated you were a Megadeth fan. I'm surprised. Well, if you know me personally, which none of you do, this actually should come as no surprise. Because I'm going to tell you something straight up right here. It's also something of a lengthy personal story. Well, I had it established that black metal is my favorite genre of metal, but it is Megadeth who are my favorite band of all time, and it was the band that pulled me not into only thrash metal, but metal as a whole. You see, I first heard of Megadeth back in 2004 when I was still in elementary school at the time, and for some reason they were on the news in my state for some reason. And one of my neighbor's friends on the bus asked me if I heard of them. Well, up until that point, no. But it was not until the following summer I was entering 6th grade and I heard their music and the title track to this album, and it was the first song of theirs I ever listened to. Since I was very young, my parents were responsible and limited my access to the internet. Since I was barely a preteen at the time, I did not really have a chance to listen to any Megadeth songs or songs from other bands I was digging. But fast forward to August 2006. So not only does this episode mark a 30-year anniversary to the metal classics of 1986, but it also marks 10 years of me becoming a regular fan and collector of heavy metal albums. But back in August 2006, my best friend's family was kind enough to take me along to a 2-week vacation to Busch Gardens in Virginia. My best friend was not the biggest fan of roller coasters, so to coax him into getting into them, his mom offered him $125 to ride the roller coaster, the Big Bad Wolf. And he did. Later, some of you will crack up knowing this was the mid-2000s, what I'm about to say right here. To spend his newly procured cash, we went to a fucking Circuit City. There, my friend generously offered to buy me 2 CDs of my choosing. And so I dashed for the M section of the Rock, and probably jizzed for the first time in my life, to find a copy of Peace Sells But Who's Buying, and I snatched it up. The other CD I got was their 1992 album, Countdown to Extinction, but the only other Megadeth songs I heard were Symphony of Destruction and the title track to Countdown. And so, the rest is history on how I became the metalhead I am today. So long story short, this album's number 1 on this list not merely because I think it's better than the others or because Megadeth is my favorite, but because I have a personal relationship with this album, and it was my very first heavy metal album, and what an album. Now with all this personal shit out of the way, let's take a look at it historically and musically. Peace Sells But Who's Buying is Megadeth's second album, being a follow-up to their 1985 debut album, Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good. And for those who don't know Megadeth, the band was founded by Dave Mustaine in 1983, having been fired from Metallica for being a rather out-of-control drunk and drug fiend. Being rather bitter about being fired from the biggest band of the American underground at the time, Dave sought to one-up Metallica at every turn. His initial approach was to do this by playing faster, heavier, and having edgier lyrical themes, to say the least, and this became clear on Megadeth's debut album. Megadeth's debut album was also a superb record, but it had a lower production, and some of the songwriting was not as refined as it would be later on, but hey, it was their first album. But even a year later, the band had drastically improved themselves with Peace Sells But Who's Buying. Whether they one-upped Metallica or not is completely subjective, but none will deny Megadeth one-upped themselves on their following album, with this release. The album is overall faster, heavier, and lyrically darker than their debut, with improved production. In fact, let's break it down track by track. Opening with the song Wake Up Dead is a song that Dave wrote about his girlfriend at the time in a scenario where he goes out cheating on her one night and returns home at 4 a.m. knowing that if he wakes up his girlfriend, she'll kill him. This is followed by The Conjuring, probably my second favorite song on the album, a brutal song about using black magic, which Dave dabbled in as a teenager. Sadly, this tune will never be played live again as a result of Dave becoming a born-again Christian, and of course singing about black magic is incompatible with his religious views. The Conjuring is followed up by the title track, which is an attack on the negative stereotypes of metalheads used by the media. Devil's Island is about the notorious French penal colony, with the heaviest intro on the record, and it is followed by Black Friday, the most ruthless Megadeth song ever composed. The subject matter is not crowds smashing into retailers the day after Thanksgiving, but is about a guy who goes on a brutal killing spree. Bad Omen is a track about a satanic ritual, which is followed by a cover of Willie Nelson's I Ain't Superstitious with altered lyrics. The album then closes with the song My Last Words, a song about the fear one goes through while playing Russian roulette. So how do they hold up? Well, I am glad this was my first proper introduction to heavy metal. Not one weak track on this record, putting it in the category of all killer and no filler, like pretty much most other records on this list. If you want a proper introduction to Megadeth, then this is the album to go with. Listen to this album in its entirety if you get the chance. To just listen to the title track is heavy metal sacrilege and a disservice to yourself, because Peace Sells But Who's Buying is the pinnacle of thrash metal. And I'm not just saying this because this is my favorite album by my favorite band, but ask anyone who listens to thrash metal religiously and they will say the same thing. Unless there's some slavering 1-inch Metallica or Slayer fan fuck. So anyway, best track. Again, due to my initial exposure, my favorite is the title track.
What do you mean I hurt your feelings? I didn't know you had any feelings. What do you mean I ain't kind? Just not your kind.
And then, which is followed by The Conjuring, and for a close third, I can't even start a picking process. Now, most people who own this album own the 2004 remastered edition form, which contained some remixes by Randy Burns, who co-produced this album's initial release in 1986. And I must say, I actually prefer his remixes with the prominent reverb more than the final album versions of the title track and The Conjuring.
What do you mean I hurt your feelings? I didn't know you had any feelings. What do you mean I ain't kind? Just not your kind.
Anyway, wrapping up, Peace Sells But Who's Buying tops this list, not only because it's a fucking masterpiece, but it was also my very first exposure to heavy metal. And with that, we conclude another top 10. You know, in some of my other videos, I expressed my plans for other series, and there's one idea I was on the fence about doing, and for those of you who are familiar with the Rageaholic, he has an epic series called Metal Mythos, where he reviews the entire discography of legendary metal bands. I actually wanted to do something like that, but if I were to do one, I'd try not to do bands he's already done, except maybe Iron Maiden. And I'd be more open to reviewing EPs and live releases if I felt they were, you know, a significant part to the band's overall history. But if I ever ended up deciding doing that, you can be sure Megadeth would be the very first band I review. I mean, the only thing holding me back is trying to figure out an approach to such a task that is significantly different than his, so I don't get accused of ripping him off. But hey, I'll figure out something, or maybe not at all and not do anything, but whatever. Now, I tell you this because now, having done 2 top 10s involving metal, I want my next one to not only not involve metal, but not include music as a whole. Mostly like involving video games or a series I watch. I don't know, but I'll figure that out. But I will probably tell you this. I mean, eventually I will probably plan on doing maybe a top 10, another top 10 for next year, doing the top albums in 1987. That will be a thing apart from the next one, which won't involve metal at all. And then maybe 82, so I could catch up, so I don't get one every year. So anyway, well, that's all the plans I have for now. So until then, have fun and fucking slay.
Well, thank you very much for coming to see me.
You're welcome.
And I'm going to try and pronounce a name now. Wendy Malmsteen.
Oh, Amanda, you stupid woman. Try again.
Winwy Malmsteen?
Ingve Malmsteen.
Ingve Malmsteen, sorry. I'll see you tonight.